Many women grew up with a surprisingly incomplete map of their own anatomy. Most of us don't realize it until much, much later in life. Because for a long time, even medicine didn't have the full picture. In 1998, modern medical imaging finally mapped the full structure of the clitoris. Not just the small external points that most people were taught about, the entire internal structure. For comparison, humans landed on the moon in 1969. Let that sink in for a moment. We walked on the moon almost 30 years before medicine properly mapped a major sensory organ in the female body. And that contrast tells you something interesting about scientific priorities and raises an important question. If the anatomy was mapped in 1998, what did medicine believe the anatomy looked like before that? If we haven't met yet, I am Fleur Choy. On this channel, I explore how the nervous system shapes the way women experience pleasure, desire, and connection. Because the female body is not random. She is organized, responsive, intelligent. And yet, for a long time, too long, the map many women were given of their own bodies was simply incomplete. Most people grew up thinking the clitoris is a tiny structure, almost like a little button. But that's not the full anatomy. The clitoris is actually a much larger internal sensory organ. Most of it lies inside the body. In other words, what we see externally is only the visible tip to a much larger sensory network. Once you realize that, another question naturally appears. If the anatomy was always there, why wasn't it studied more carefully earlier? Now, here is where the story becomes interesting. The anatomy wasn't completely unknown. In 1844, a German anatomist named Georg Ludwig Kobelt, sorry if I butcher this, described this organ in remarkable detail. So the knowledge existed, which raised an even more interesting question. If scientists already knew this in the 1800s, why did that knowledge never become standard in medical education? Instead, simplified programs became the norm, and for generations of students and doctors, the clitoris appeared in the textbooks as a small external point. Most people grew up with an incomplete map of their own body. Now, let me ask you something. If you think back to your own education, did anyone ever show you a complete anatomical diagram of the clitoris? Unfortunately, most people answer no. When the map is incomplete, something very predictable happens because many women grow up thinking their bodies are confusing, maybe difficult or inconsistent. Very often, the body is not a mystery. There is information missing in our education. I see this moment of realization often with the awesome women I work with. Sometimes it happens in their 30s, sometimes in their 40s, sometimes even later. And when the anatomy finally becomes clear, the body begins to make a lot more sense. The story of the clitoris is actually a story about knowledge. What gets studied, what gets ignored, and how those choices shape the way people understand themselves. When anatomy is simplified, education becomes simplified. And when education becomes simplified, people often believe that their bodies are the problem. So the moon comparison isn't really about space exploration. It's about perspective. Humanity invested enormous effort into understanding the outer universe. But the inner landscape of the female body received far less attention. That's part of the reason I started this channel, because these conversations about the body deserve definitely more space. Before we finish, I'm curious about something. When did you first learn that the clitoris was actually a much larger internal structure? Was that something you learned in school, or was it something you discovered much later on your own? Maybe just even now on this channel. Let me know in the comments. I have a feeling the answer might say a lot about how we were taught to understand the body, and if conversations like this help your body make a little more sense, you're very welcome to subscribe.